Hello again and welcome back. I'm Mark McIntire and this is Freedom Matters with Mark McIntire. I'm very pleased to be your host. And what we do here is very simple. We invite guests who specialize in affecting and influencing policy on a wide range of topics: law, education, science, politics, and the arts. And these are individuals who are very well prepared to drill down on our basic concept of freedom. So what we do is we invite these influencers, if you want to call them that, we invite them to have a conversation with us, and we ask them to find the assumptions to their notion of freedom and how it evolved. And we certainly have an individual with us today who fits the bill, the exact purpose of our show. His name is Curt Levey, and he's an attorney. He's also the president of the Committee for Justice in Washington, D.C. Now, this is an organization that's devoted to promoting the rule of law and a constitutionalist judiciary. You have to brush your teeth to say that, by the way. He's also a veteran of many confirmation battles with the Supreme Court, I think he started back in 2010 with Elena Kagan, but we'll check that when we get him on. He's also the Legal Affairs Fellow at Freedom Works, we've heard of them, and he also serves as on the executive committee of the Federalist Society Civil Rights Practices Group. After graduating from Harvard University in law with honors and clerking for the United States Court of Appeals in the Sixth Circuit, Mr. Levey served as Director of Legal and Public Affairs at the Center for Individual Rights, and we've all heard of them. There he worked on landmark Supreme Court cases, including the University of Michigan affirmative action cases, and we were very interested in how that one turned out. He also has a successful Supreme Court constitutional challenge on the Violence Against Women Act. Now, after Mr. Levey, he headed over to the Education Department, where he headed up the Title IX policy group in that department. But the most interesting thing about our guest today, I think, is the fact that before he got his JD degree at Harvard University with honors, he also picked up a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in computer science. And this has opened up a whole new world of law for him. He even developed his own artificial intelligence application. And so we're going to have, if we have time, we're going to make time to make sure that we talk about how Mr. Levey is expanding his legal practice into areas like social media, the internet, and how this affects, again, individual freedom and group freedom. So without any further ado, I really want to welcome Curt Levey to our show. Welcome, Curt.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, let's start with our very first. We actually did collaborate on some of the questions that we'll be asking. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of these. I'm just going to highlight, because I want you to stay with this program. We're going to be asking what is Curt Levey's basic concept of freedom and how he evolved it. What is the Committee for Justice? Why was it created? What influence does it have? How does it really work? We're also going to be asking him his evaluation of how the concept of individual freedom and group freedom has evolved through the judiciary over the last 50 years. I think we've all agreed that there has been a change. We're also going to ask him about future projects for the Committee of Justice, and we're going to get to the new area of law, computer science, and the artificial intelligence and how that affects freedom. So, Curt, why don't you just begin by explaining how Curt Levey conceptualizes and makes his assumptions about individual freedom. What's your idea?
Sure. I think of freedom as being free of government coercion and being free of intrusions from government or other individuals into life, liberty, property rights. And, I think that's a very different, I think many libertarians and even conservatives have similar conception of freedom. Of course, I think it's very different from the progressive vision of freedom, which is so-called positive rights, like freedom means having guaranteed health care, things like that. But I don't want to get too much into that, except to say that my vision of freedom is almost the opposite. It's basically the right to be let alone.
Has this always been your concept of freedom, or did it evolve through your education system?
Well, I started, if you want to go back all the way to my teenage years, I think I started out as maybe more of a traditional conservative, but I realized that using government to enforce one's conservative values is not really any better than using it to enforce progressive values. And so I evolved by the time I was in college into a libertarian.
Okay, good. So you do identify yourself as a libertarian.
Yeah, very much so. I probably still have a little bit of conservative bias. And I think conservatives are, certainly in general more favor of limited government. But, let's be honest, some conservatives have a blind spot to certain areas of government power. The military, the criminal justice system. A lot of people who would never want a EPA regulator to show up at their door are sort of, fine with the police busting down your door if they think you're selling drugs.
Yeah. Is there any particular writer or any particular thinker that influenced you when you were a student? I know for myself, for instance, I was influenced by Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton, the British philosopher who has written the book Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands. We're going to have him on the show, by the way. So I've always interested in how other thinkers have influenced our thought. How did that relate to what happened to you?
I think a lot of the writers you mentioned sort of came after in college, after I already had my philosophy. I guess if you're looking back to early on, I was probably influenced by Buckley and the National Review. I didn't know about a lot of conservative publications, to be honest with you, when I was a high school student, but that was readily available. I'm sometimes a little bit envious of high school students today because, it's just so easy, frankly, to find conservative voices, and not necessarily even just intellectual voices.
Yeah, the reason I raised
turn
this,
on TV or radio, and they're all over the place.
The reason I raised this is because it was interesting to me that when Bill Buckley wrote God and Man at Yale, he never even used the word conservative until he read Russell Kirk. And Russell Kirk actually was the trigger point for Bill Buckley to actually identify himself as a conservative, and probably the leading American. Yeah.
And to be fair, the meaning of conservative has differed. I think back in Kirk's day, it was maybe a little bit more traditional conservative values, and it's a little more libertarian or limited government today. But I think conservative often is used in the same way the term center-right is, to really include a variety of philosophies that range from, libertarian to traditional conservative.
Right. Now, how did you get involved in becoming president of the Committee for Justice? You're ideally set up for it, being a libertarian on the one hand, and being a lawyer on the other hand, and specializing in the judiciary constitutionalist process. How did you evolve into becoming, did you found the Committee of Justice? No.
No, I didn't. It was founded by C. Boyden Gray, who
Oh,
had been
really?
President Bush's White House counsel. And at the time, this was early in the second President Bush's administration, the Democrats were basically obstructing Bush's judicial nominees.
Yeah.
And one of the big reasons, if you ask Bush or Rove or people like that Bush was elected was his promise to appoint judges who would show fidelity to the Constitution and to statutory text and not be activists. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats, of course, didn't like that and were trying to slow that down as much as they could. And so a bunch of folks, including C. Boyden Gray, got together and set up the Committee for Justice. And I didn't enjoy, that was 2002. I didn't join until 2005. And then originally I was general counsel, and then I became president, I believe, 2007.
Right. And so its creation, what was the goal or the intent of forming it in the mind of C. Boyden Gray, if you know?
Yeah, the most immediate was to defend Bush's judicial nominees, to put forth ways that we were hoping that Republican senators would fight the obstruction. And then also, at the end of the day, to educate people about how constitutional interpretation should work, and also how the nomination and confirmation process should work, that it's not supposed to be highly politicized, for example. And, once you start getting the judicial nominations, that's so closely tied to issues of constitutional interpretation that, of course, we started getting into a variety of constitutional issues tackled by the courts, especially the Supreme Court. And, slowly our mission grew. And as you mentioned, more recently it has involved law and technology, although still comes back to the basic mission of, for example, there are conservatives today that would love to regulate the hell out of the giant tech companies. And we, for example, oppose that because we still believe in our basic mission of limited government.
Yeah, and for the reason being the limitation of government as it impinges upon individual freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I suppose if government did not coerce us and take away our freedom, then I'd feel very differently about it.
It's a strange. I know the Bill Buckley. I interviewed Bill Buckley for a magazine back in the early '80s, and during our interview then, we reviewed the fact that it's very much a mercurial line between conservatism and libertarianism. Really, nobody knows where one begins and the other ends. It's very hard to list a syllabus of differences. Because they both believe that the less government we have is the better option in general. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, I think traditional conservatives are willing to have big government in certain areas, as I said, in reducing crime and in a military. Now, no one's even the biggest liberal is not completely against the military, so it's a matter of degree. But I do think that conservatives, including Buckley, have at least a suspicion of government power. And at the end, the problem is that at the end of the day, if once you give government power, it's not just going to use that power for the policies you agree with.
Yeah. One of the things that amazes people when they talk about Bill Buckley is that he wrote a very famous article about the legalization of drugs, if you'll recall. And this was he almost lost his whole magazine. He almost lost his entire support base, and a lot of his donors actually quit on him because he stood up for this libertarian idea that if you want to ruin your life with drugs, go right ahead. That's your freedom to do so. Be my guest. Now, if you damage somebody, if you hurt somebody, if you impinge upon my rights or our rights as individuals, well, then the penalties are going to be very severe, very severe. And that was his position. Yeah.
Treat people like adults. Give them
treat
freedom.
People like adults. Exactly.
And if they do harm, they're responsible for it. And I actually use that very question about drugs a lot of times to get a sense when I'm talking to somebody if they're more a traditional conservative or a libertarian. And I guess I'm always surprised how many people, even people who might call themselves libertarian, just are not comfortable with the idea of legalizing drugs, or they want to limit it just to marijuana. So I guess in that sense, I don't think of myself as a radical libertarian, but on that I am. I think at the end of the day, there's many ways to ruin your life and even kill yourself, including with alcohol.
Knock yourself out, literally.
I think for the most part, people who are self-destructive will find a way to be
they're determined to find a way, absolutely. Now, let's get into some of the Supreme Court battles that you have been involved in. What was your first confirmation battle that you dug your heels into and grappled with?
Roberts.
Really? Okay, Roberts. Okay.
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
When I was at the education department, well, I should back up a step and say that, I had heard stories for people who had been in D.C. later, longer than me, who had worked on the Bork battle, which was very tough, and the Thomas battle, that was very tough. And so I had sort of long had in the back of my mind that I wanted to, work on one of them. And when O'Connor resigned, I almost immediately left the education department to join the Committee for Justice because I so much wanted to work on it. I thought at the time there hadn't been a Supreme Court vacancy in a dozen years. I thought this is my one chance. Now, of course, I was wrong. I've since worked on 8 if you include Harriet Myers. But that was
yeah.
my thinking at the time.
Yeah. Now let's go back to the Bork and Thomas nominations, because there are a lot of our fans here and subscribers. Some of them are very young. Let's put it that way, and they really don't have any institutional history with respect to SCOTUS, and so they don't remember what happened with Robert Bork, and the difference between how Bork was borked. Because now that's become a verb in our language. You can be borked if you are impeded or otherwise blocked from becoming a Supreme Court justice. There's a difference between what happened to Robert Bork and what happened to Clarence Thomas. And I'd like you to flesh that out for us, if you could.
Sure. I mean, it's sort of the two methods of, I guess you could say, borking somebody. And to be fair, there are legitimate reasons to stop nominees if they're truly not qualified, either in their background or their intellect, or if they have ethical problems. So we're talking about something different. We're talking about really it's politically motivated and you're just looking for an excuse. So the two excuses can be this person has extreme views. That's what was done to Robert Bork. There's a famous speech that Senator Kennedy gave within hours of Bork being nominated, in which he talked about Bork's America, in which, women would have back alley abortions, black people couldn't, sit at the lunch counter, and lots of other things. You couldn't read the books you wanted to read, lots of things that would never
Was there any truth? Was there any truth to what Senator Kennedy was accusing Judge Bork of?
No, I mean, Bork was very much, he certainly wasn't a conservative activist. He basically believed in, deference to the legislature and textualism. He really would not have been radical, unless radical means standing up to judicial activism. But it worked. There was no committee for justice. There wasn't even, the White House wasn't even prepared for this. And they managed to, who's ever sort of first to, frame the nomination wins. And in this case, the Democrats, with help from the media, framed him as an extremist. They even homed in on his, look, that he had a beard, that made him look sinister, that he didn't smile much.
Horrible man. Doesn't smile. Yeah, horrible
man.
Bearded, doesn't smile.
Yeah.
Terrible guy.
A brilliant man. I think I don't even think anyone denied it then. But, the die was cast at that point, unfortunately.
So in your view, Curt, how does the American population swallow this transition between, okay, we don't want this judge to be on the Supreme Court because he's incompetent or she's incompetent. That's perfectly. How did the media slide happen such that, now we're interested whether he has a beard, or we're interested in whether he smiles or not? There seems to be some transition point where people's feelings became far more important than their logic or their reasoning. Or am I just stupid?
No. Well, up until early in the 20th century, they didn't have hearings. So,
I didn't know that.
Not to mention they didn't have TV either. So, these things, personality traits, and whether you had a beard, played much less of a role. And then even when they started with hearings, it wasn't the week-long affair that we have now with, the nation tuned into their TVs to watch it. So, part of it is the more TV coverage, but I think part of it is also our society. We are a more sort of visually oriented society. I mean, maybe that goes along with the fact, that people don't have the attention spans that they once did. So if you can make someone look sinister, that's going to be much more effective than trying to make intellectual arguments for why they are or are not sinister.
So Bork was borked because he had a beard and he didn't look very cuddly. He didn't look very, very emotionally pleasing to people. Wasn't like a big teddy bear. Now let's move over to the Clarence Thomas. There's a big ground shift here. There's a big sea change now. By the time we get to Clarence Thomas, they borked him, or tried to bork him. He actually was, he's a sitting justice now. So examine, if you will, or go back, roll back into why, what was the nature of the attack against Clarence Thomas?
Sure. They were particularly motivated there because, of course, Thomas was replacing the first black justice, who was very liberal, Marshall.
Yes.
But by the same token, it's, political correctness being what it was. They couldn't savage Thomas in quite the way they did Bork. And so they hit upon something very similar to what happened with Kavanaugh, not an allegation of sexual assault, but sexual harassment. And, there really was no evidence. The evidence actually was to the contrary, because Anita Hill, who was supposedly sexually harassed, happily followed Thomas from the education department where the harassment had supposedly occurred to the EEOC. So, and of course they made all the argument, with Kavanaugh was, well, just because somebody doesn't tell anyone, maybe it's because they're so traumatized. And same argument was made with Thomas. Well, sometimes women are so traumatized that, they just follow the person, almost a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing. So I'll leave that to your viewers to decide, if that's ever true. But the bottom line is, the evidence that was out there did not seem to back up the claim, but it almost destroyed him. And another parallel with Kavanaugh is it was Thomas's impassioned defense at the hearings, where he got very emotional, that really saved the day. And of course, we saw that all these years later with Kavanaugh as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I watched the Thomas hearings. I was riveted. I was teaching philosophy in Massachusetts at the time, and I was absolutely riveted to the screen because I couldn't believe that innuendo and unsubstantiated allegations could quite possibly sink a Supreme Court justice. I watched in horror and astonishment when Anita Hill, who, by the way, later became a philosophy professor, my discipline, right? They always cause trouble, these philosophy professors. They're always troublemakers. So when her strongest argument against Justice Thomas from ascending to the Supreme Court was, one day she claimed, without any proof, without any corroboration, without any physical evidence, no videotape, no audio tape, she said that one day, while she was working with Justice Thomas, who was at the Department of Education at the time, she said that Thomas came into her office and said, wait for it, who put pubic hair on my Coke can? And I remember for days, the media was transfixed with this metaphor of a pubic hair on a Coke can that could possibly unhinge a Supreme Court nomination. And it seemed to me, I thought he was going to lose. I thought he was going to be rejected. I really did. It was Joe Biden, I think, ironically enough. It was Joe Biden, who was chair of the Judiciary Committee at the time, and he made an impassioned defense of Justice Thomas. That this had no place, these kinds of statements had no place on the bearing of an outcome. It was amazing. All right, well, let's move on to the Gorsuch and the Kavanaugh. What was the role that the Committee for Justice played in both of those nominations?
We supported both nominations. And of course, before the nominations occur, if it's the Supreme Court, there's of course a lot of public debate about who the nominee should be, and we weigh in there, and we hope that our friends in the White House listen, although we have no formal role in the process. And I should point out that things are a little different in what our role generally is in a GOP administration, because there we try to have influence over who gets nominated, not just in the confirmation process. Needless to say, in a Democratic administration, no one's going to take our phone calls.
Probably not. Now, do you think that you had some influence on the selection of Gorsuch? Do you think that the Committee for Justice actually had some influence on that, or what? What's your view?
I would say that I hate to. We're certainly not responsible for him.
No.
There's a number of groups such as ours, but I think the fact that when he got on the short list, that groups like ours were very supportive of the idea. Certainly kept him in the running. I think at the very end, when it came down to Hardman versus Gorsuch, my sense is that was very much the president's decision. But in narrowing the short list and even winning it down to a couple of people, groups like ours can have an effect. Mm-hmm. And not because, the White House is under any obligation to listen to us, but, one of the considerations that they want to take into account is how enthusiastic the base is going to be. Yeah. And, we speak, at least on this one issue, judicial nominations, we speak for the base. And if the nominee doesn't have the support of the base, as happened with Harriet Miers, they're in real trouble because they're not going to have the support of the Democrats. That's for sure.
Yeah. Now I noticed you've been writing for the Wall Street Journal. You've written for a lot of popular journalistic outlets. You've appeared on C-SPAN several times. I've been watching some of your YouTube. In fact, our viewers can just type your name into YouTube and find scads of video that really present how Curt Levey and the Committee for Justice actually takes the offensive rather than the defensive with respect to media. I think that libertarians and conservatives have learned their lesson. They, during the Kennedy administration, they kind of backed off with respect to becoming affirmative and becoming aggressive with media. But it seems to me one of the things that you guys do, men and women at the Committee for Justice, is that you actually are very proactive with respect to the media. You write articles, you get interviewed, you present the case for the person that you're backing. Is that correct? Is that what you do?
Yes. No. I mean, that's the main influence. It's not like we have $100 million to hand out in contributions to have effect that way. Mm-hmm. Can you still see me, by the way? I've lost.
We can. We've got a freeze frame picture of you, but you can still keep talking, and we'll try to settle this in post production.
Okay, I'm trying to remember what I was saying now.
You were talking.
What was your?
Yeah, you were talking about the type of influence you certainly don't have. You can't pick up the phone and just call the White House.
So our form of lobbying, frankly, is not handing out a lot of money. Our influence comes through, as you say, being proactive with the media mm-hmm. and developing relationships with people on the Hill, staff and senators, since the senators are the ones who confirm or don't confirm, and folks in the White House. So yeah, I think for a small nonprofit that doesn't have multi-million dollars, being proactive with the media is vitally important.
Yeah. Now let's move on to the Kavanaugh hearings.
Sure.
And I want to put the backdrop up here that I'm going to be asking you about how to evaluate the transition of the notion of individual freedom that is now being used to put a microscope on the lives of individuals like Kavanaugh. If we, and this is a recent example, so my millennial friends and my iGen audience out there, Alex Madagian and his crowd, they witnessed the Kavanaugh thing, and in talking with the iGen people, Alex's generation, more so than the millennials, they were absolutely appalled that we have arrived at a state where, of course, they knew nothing about Anita Hill. Right, but they were appalled that we've arrived at a state where mere accusation against a man concerning sexual improprieties, mere accusation, no proof, no corroboration, no forensics, no arrest record, no police, nothing, zero, can actually destroy a person. They were appalled at this, and they consider this to be an extreme violation of individual freedom. Is that how you see it, or is that not?
Yeah, I mean, nobody can stand up to that. I mean, it's one thing if you're not famous, people don't have a very big incentive to make up things about you, and most people don't know who you are. But when half the country is highly motivated to see you defeated, as happened with Kavanaugh, yeah. And everyone knows your name, all you need is one person who. I don't know whether, Christine Ford believed what she said or not, but all you need is one person who thinks you did something, almost 40 years ago, and that can destroy not just your nomination, your career, your life. I mean,
Yeah, you have Ted Kennedy, who actually causes the death of a woman. he's been reelected, or he was reelected. The Democrats didn't seem to care two hoots or a holler about the fact that how he treated women. She died. Mary Jo Kopechne died that night, and he gets a pass. Bill Clinton gets a pass, even though there's a semen-stained blue dress hanging in the Oval Office. For all to see and for Congress to evaluate during the impeachment process. And then you have Cory Booker, and you have all of these recent examples where the metric that if a woman accuses you of sexual impropriety, you're guilty, that only works if you're a libertarian or a conservative. It doesn't work if you're a Democrat. And do they expect that we don't notice this? Or what? What is the... do they think we're that stupid? Seriously?
I mean, it works. This is a little bit off the topic of freedom, but I think as long as it remains so one-sided, where a conservative can be quickly chased off the public scene if they even say something politically incorrect, and Joe Biden, bless his heart, can say, racially and gender inappropriate things all the time and survive, then why shouldn't the Democrats try it? I mean, if it's only going to hurt Republicans, why not? So, my own personal belief is we need to push back more. But you're right how you describe it right now. It is pretty much a one-sided thing. It looks like the three top officials in Virginia, despite charges of blackface and sexual harassment, are going to stay in office. So, there's an example of which party you want to be in if you're a sexual harasser.
Yeah, it's incredible. That, of course, brings us up to my next topic that I wanted to go over with you, and that is talking about individual freedom. When is a person, and when can we kill this entity? And of course, that brings up the whole concept of you just lost your light there.
I see that.
Go ahead. Turn it on. We'll solve that in post-production. Yeah.
There we go.
All right.
I don't know how that, but it's back.
That's all right. This is the bird. You look terrific. Of course, the governor of Virginia had just signed a bill or approved of a bill that some have said, I haven't read the bill myself, but some have said that allows aborting a child after it leaves the womb. The interesting thing to me is that people are more upset about his blackface photograph in a yearbook when he was in med school than they are about the whole concept of, so now we're going to kill babies after they're born instead of inside the womb. So you talk about individual freedom. I mean, is there any greater assault on individual freedom than the idea of being killed?
Yeah, and that's why I always think it's funny that progressives consider abortion to be one of the most precious constitutional rights. It's funny because it's not actually in the Constitution, right. And it's funny because there's a lot, regardless of what you think about abortion does involve another life. We can debate if it's human yet at that point.
Right.
So, it's at best a complex issue at any stage. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to look for the right to be let alone, there's about 1,000 other rights that should probably get priority over that one, because that one is you're not asking to be let alone. You're asking to kill another life. And again, we can debate when that's justified. I would hope that most Americans still don't think that it's, justified, late in the third trimester, perhaps even after the baby is born. But I don't know. It may be true of the average American. I don't know if it's going to be true of the average Democratic presidential nominee, because they just seem to be competing to be further and further to the left.
Yeah, well, there's this transition in the whole definition of a person, and the consequent freedom and the rights of the individual in terms of birth actually evolves from academia. Most of this stuff comes out. Peter Seeger, I don't know if you know who that is, but he is a professor of ethics at Princeton University. He has written an essay which now is iconic in the abortion community, pro-abortion community. And in his essay, he says that if you have a baby and you birth the baby, you can take it home for 30 days, and there's a return policy. You can abort it after 30 days. If it turns out you don't like this baby for some reason, you can terminate the baby. You can take it back to the hospital and they'll kill it for you. I mean, when I was in high school, if you told me that I would live long enough to actually experience reading an article like that, I would have told that you were on crack cocaine, that you're drinking paint. It's incredible.
Well, if you follow some of the liberal arguments for abortion, you know what follows. For example, one of the arguments is you have the right to do whatever you want with your own body, which I happen to think should be the case when there's not another life involved. Unfortunately, it's not even the case. You know, we can't take drugs and legal drugs unless they're FDA approved. Mm-hmm. But if you have the right to do whatever you want with your own body, I guess you have the right to go on vacation while your 30-day-old infant, stays home and starves to death. I mean, if you really think that you have the right to do whatever you want with your own body, regardless of the consequences for others, then I guess, the Seeger view applies. Or if you think that, it's better to be aborted or killed than it is to be unwanted, then the Seeger argument applies. Or if you think that babies threaten women's, mental health, then the Seeger argument applies. So as extreme as that Seeger view is, it does logically follow from a lot of the arguments that the pro-choice people make. Look, if people want to say they're for abortion as a matter of policy, we should be able to debate that. Now, of course, we really can't because the Supreme Court has, taken it off the table. But at least make honest arguments. And I think some of the arguments I just mentioned are, sort of disingenuous ones.
Yeah. Before I started our interview, I was actually reading an article from Skeptic Magazine, published by my friend who was on the show before you, Michael Shermer. Michael didn't write this article, but somebody else did. And the article tries to redefine personhood by saying that if a person, if a human being or if a human entity was never conscious or has ceased to be conscious, then they cannot claim personhood. So these philosophers are always tinkering with this idea that we can somehow redefine personhood according to some marker. In this case, the marker of consciousness. Well, as you just pointed out, if we follow the logic of, let's say we accept this new metric of, well, if you're not conscious or you never have been conscious, you're not a person. Well, doesn't that permit us to drive out to the nearest old folks home and find people who are in advanced cases of Alzheimer's and just kill them because they're not conscious? So we're not only talking about murdering babies after the womb, but the logic would seem to dictate that we can go to the old folks' home and just start killing people.
Well, I think the reason the latter is not legal and abortion is because the people who make the decisions, the voters, are very threatened by the idea that when they're old, someone could kill them. But they're not threatened by the idea, many of them at least are not, that a fetus can be aborted because they're never going to be a fetus again.
Well, I don't know about that because, in California, there's the right to die law. So assisted suicide, I think, is going to be fast-tracked now. Now that the infanticide thing is on the front burner, I think the assisted suicide thing is going to be, and there's so many problems with that because how do you know that the person is consenting to suicide? Even though they signed a paper saying, kill me, they may have changed their mind, and may be unable to communicate that change of mind. So
I should point out that the Supreme Court refused to rule that you had a right to assisted suicide, which again I sort of find puzzling because there is not another right involved. There's another individual's rights involved. Now there's all the problems that you talked about why society probably shouldn't allow it. But at least that's a clearer case than for abortion. So it just shows how sui generis Roe v. Wade was. And it lives on only because there's such a powerful lobby for it.
And that Roe v. Wade was written, I think the majority decision was written by Thurgood Marshall. Am I right about that? I hope I'm right about that. And of course, Justice Thomas replaced Thurgood Marshall on the court, as you had pointed out. So these are the challenges that the law is encountering with respect to individual freedom, the freedom of the individual freedom and protection of infants and old people, people who are innocent and can't defend themselves. I wanted to ask you, since you're involved in judicial confirmation hearings, what is your probability that Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be leaving the court one way or another in the near future, and that President Trump will get another pick at the Supreme Court? What's your prediction here? Or are you capable of making a prediction? Do you want to make a prediction?
I'm not a doctor, but I do know that she's 85, and the average justice is gone by 85, not gone from this world, but gone from the court. And I do know, unfortunately, most human beings don't make it to their 90s. So I wish her good health, but the chances that she'll be here, if Trump gets reelected, chances that she'll be on the court 6 years from now are small. But I could definitely see her making it 2 years. And Breyer is about 80, so how much longer is he going to serve? And
isn't Stevens 92? Is Stevens 92? There's a 92-year-old on the court, isn't there? Is it Stevens?
No, there's not now. Okay. But Stevens did serve till 90.
Yeah. So he kind of broke the glass ceiling.
Right, but we're not all look. Stevens is now either 97 or 98 and still going strong.
Yeah.
But most of us are not going to be that lucky. And even Thomas, people have speculated that maybe he'll want to retire because right now you have a Republican Senate and a Republican president, and we don't know how long that's going to last or when we're going to have it again. So, there's a few justices that could retire very soon. So, if you, any one of those retirements might be unlikely, but the chance that none of them will retire sometime soon, I think is less than 50%. Or to put it another way, I think there's a good chance there'll be a vacancy sometime in the next, few years.
Yeah. The Committee for Justice also gets involved in the confirmation process of judiciary appointments below the Supreme Court. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we
focus on the appeals courts, the circuit courts, just because they tend to make law. Although district court judges aren't supposed to make law, although more and more with their issuing national injunctions now that at least some of the more liberal district court judges have become part of the Trump resistance. Maybe we need to focus more on district court judges.
Yeah,
as well.
I wanted to drill down on that with you, Curt. I believe it was Alexander Hamilton who really defined the distinction between the absolute rule of law and the powerful or the power of law. I'm not a JD, although I did play one on TV. Just saying. I don't have a JD. Anyway, but can you explain for our audience the basic differences between those who advocate an absolutist view of law, that is to say the Supreme Court is sort of like revealed truth from God, I guess that's how I would capture it, or the Hamiltonian view that the judiciary can get it wrong and they can self-correct. How does that work? What is your view on that?
Well, certainly the judiciary can self-correct. Even the biggest, advocates of stare decisis, which is basically just sort of another word for
standing law,
adhering to precedent, still would recognize that there are cases where precedent should be overturned. I thought you might also be asking about judicial supremacy, the idea that something that was debated certainly by the founding fathers. Marshall, early on, I think it was 1803, put forth the idea of judicial supremacy, and it's only grown since. But, certainly at the time of Lincoln, for example, he took the position that Dred Scott applied only to the parties involved, that it was not, that just because they had ruled on a case and controversy, which is what the Constitution gives the courts the ability to do, doesn't mean that they have the right to, make law through precedent. Now, of course, the Civil War sort of settled that question, as did the Civil War amendments. But, I think, certainly in some circles, that question is very much alive today. And I think the more judges push things, for example, by issuing national injunctions to block almost everything that Trump does, the more you're inviting the president to do what Lincoln did and say, you know what, you may have the absolute word when it comes to the parties involved in that case or controversy, but you don't have the final word when it comes to constitutional interpretation in general. Certainly, there's nothing in the Constitution itself that, put aside Marbury v. Madison, the Marshall decision I was referring to, but in the Constitution itself, there is nothing that says that Supreme Court is the final arbiter on constitutional interpretation.
Yeah, and I'm really happy that you did that. That was a great first lecture on Marbury versus Madison. That most law school students, that's the first thing they get taught. So where do you see the court going with respect to protecting individual freedom as you have been describing it in your own mind? Where do you see the tendency? Where's the trending going here?
Well, let's look at what's happened over the last 100 years or so. Right around the 1900 or so, the so-called Lochner era, the courts were vigorously enforcing the limits on Congress's power by striking down, say, overly broad uses of the Commerce Clause, and also protecting some of the economic liberty found in the Constitution, in the Lochner case saying that New York State couldn't regulate the hours in bake shops. But that came to an end when FDR appointed enough justices to the court. Of course, first he tried to intimidate them with his court packing scheme, and then at the end of the day, it wasn't really necessary because he just was president long enough to appoint most of the justices.
Right.
And so, the protection of economic liberty sort of went away after 1937. And then you had the Warren Court. I mean, Warren became Chief Justice in 50s, but most of the excesses were, in the 60s and then continued under Berger in the 70s. But I lumped that all into the Warren Court. And they did some good things, such as protect individual liberty under the 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment. Especially with regard to criminal defendants. But they also invented new rights, such as the right to abortion and, rights to due process for government benefits and, rights to education, etc. And they also found ways to uphold federal statutes that we would have previously thought unconstitutional. As much as we like the goals of some of the civil rights statutes, they would never have been upheld in a previous day, not only because they went beyond the Commerce Clause, but also because they came into conflict with freedom of association, freedom of speech, and even economic liberty. So, I would say in general, freedom took a further step back in the Warren Court. And while things haven't been as bad in terms of inventing new rights since the Warren Court, things haven't gotten better either. Again, it tends to be a one-way ratchet. So we have the gay marriage decision. I think as a matter of policy, I think gay marriage is great. I should be able to marry whoever you want, assuming, they're a consenting adult.
Even your cat?
But to say there's a constitutional right to it is to invent something from whole cloth. So, and that really does, people like, well, how does gay marriage impinge on your freedom? And it doesn't as a matter of policy, but it does as a matter of the fact that I, as an American citizen, have the same right as every other citizen, which is that the nation's policy should be determined democratically through our elected representatives. And when the Supreme Court takes that out of Congress's hands, or out of the hands of state legislatures, they're violating, again, one of our most basic democratic rights.
So I can marry my grandmother if I love her.
As a libertarian, go ahead if you want to.
Really? Well, she's not around, so I'm not going to do that. Yeah. What I'm really interested in, though, is more alarming than marrying my grandmother or marrying anything or any person is the whole idea of the homosexual bake shop. The Colorado Bakery. I'm just fascinated by that case as how it has limited, or the attack on individual freedom that has blown out of this particular case. It's just amazing to me. And they're still pursuing this poor baker to try to force him to create a cake Can the government do that? I mean, is this constitutional?
Well, the Supreme Court will tell us very soon. They issued a very limited decision in the first case like that to come to them, Masterpiece Cake Shop. Now they have another one, so we'll see what happens with that. A lot of these civil rights, there certainly is no protection of gay rights in the federal Constitution,
Right.
Nor for that matter is there even in federal law. But various states have created civil rights statutes that protect gay rights, and they are entitled to do so as long as it doesn't infringe on other rights. Now, as I said a moment ago, one could argue that it infringes on freedom of association, for example, but the Supreme Court has said no to that, and the Supreme Court no longer really recognizes economic rights, but the Supreme Court does still recognize basically religion and religious expression. And so what people are arguing, what the bakers are arguing in this case, is that you're asking them not just to sell you an item off the shelf, but you're asking them to take part in an expressive act, designing a cake. And they shouldn't have to design a cake that violates their religious values. Now, to me, that's a constitutional right, freedom of religion, versus a state statute. To me, it's clear that the constitutional right should triumph. But, given political correctness and how it influences the courts, I'm not sure how it'll come out until it's decided. I think the baker in the case currently before the court will win, but may win on very narrow grounds.
Interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting. Of course, the members of the court, they do read the newspapers. They do go on the internet. They do watch television. I'm sure that they have their iPhones with them at all times, and they're certainly subjected to the media bombardment that is going on.
I wish they wouldn't. By the way, I wish they wouldn't. Of course.
Yeah, I'm happy that
people always ask, why do the Republican justices often drift left? And I think it's because when you're on the Supreme Court, you get a lot of press coverage, and they care about, their coverage in the press, and they care about what law school professors think of them. And both of those groups, journalists and law school professors, are, overwhelmingly liberal. And I think that, even the most independent-minded of us are, at least subtly affected by what, powerful people think of us.
Yeah, there's some speculation that John Roberts, for instance, has been susceptible to that type of pressure in some of his decisions under the court. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that our audience realizes there's a website for Committee for Justice, and on the website you can find a lot of links and a lot of citations for cases that the committee has been prosecuting, in the sense of they've been advocating for, not prosecuting themselves. But so I wanted to. I think it's up there. Yeah, it's up there now on the www is up there now. So be aware of the fact that this is an extremely important issue that's going to affect your life and the life of your children and your grandchildren for many, many generations. What happens in these courts is of vital interest. I'm 74 years old, and I've seen the transition from, the Warren Court, which was the first court that I knew of when I was a child, back in the 50s, and now we have, the John Roberts Court, which is a very, very different cup of tea, and the whole process is completely skewed now towards popularity, media coverage, feelings, our feelings. So. We got 4 minutes now, 4:02 on the clock. Where are you going now? Where's the Committee for Justice headed? What's on the immediate horizon for you, Curt?
Sure. In the short term, Trump has made great judicial nominations. Certainly best since Reagan, maybe the best ever. And the Democrats are doing their best to slow things down. They can no longer stop them with a filibuster, but because of a 30-hour debate rule, they can slow them down. So, we're hoping for reform there. Probably have to use the so-called nuclear option, where you use a simple majority to change the rules. Also, to the best of our ability, applying some public pressure on that issue. A little bit longer term, of course, we expect another Supreme Court vacancy, and already people are thinking about who the nominees should be. So, we try to have our say there. And then
Do you have anybody in mind?
what was that?
Do you have anybody in mind that you'd like to see nominated?
I won't speculate.
Yeah.
Although I guess I will say that most people seem to think that if Ginsburg is the next to leave, that it'll be a woman or a minority. But I won't comment one way or another because it really involves mind reading.
How did we get to the stage where certain categories have to be filled? Like, oh, if it's a woman who leaves the court and she's Jewish, we have to put another Jewish woman on the court. Or if she's a Catholic, we have to put a Catholic on. You know, what type of insanity is this? This is pure lunacy.
You don't have to convince me on that.
Okay. All right.
And then just very quickly, the other thing is, I don't know whether, we didn't really get into we got a little bit into my previous background before law school in artificial
we want to talk
intelligence,
about,
but we've been doing more, we've been doing the last few years, we've been focusing heavily on law and technology. A lot of those issues are very much, part of the public debate now. Data privacy, content moderation by social media,
intellectual property,
interference by foreign countries, intellectual property, antitrust. So more and more of those issues are before the Supreme Court in the public debate, and going forward, I would think we'll focus even more on law and technology.
Are you getting more solicitations from people who want you to assist them with intellectual property rights and privacy rights with social media? Are you personally, is your committee getting more requests to get into this area?
A lot of people would like us to favor a federal data privacy bill, either because they're big government liberals or because California passed its own draconian data privacy bill, which is really going to disrupt things when it comes into effect next year, and that could be preempted by federal legislation. That's an argument that I can buy, but the general argument that government should be regulating data privacy, again, I think people are intelligent and can make their own decisions, and if you want to opt out of social media, go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you, Curt Levey, for being on our show. Ladies and gentlemen, get on that website, and thank you so much for being with us. We'll be seeing you next time on Freedom Matters with Mark McIntire. Bye, Curt.
Thank you so much.
Bye.